And thank you everybody out there in Zoom world for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be your host this evening for the second of our Distinguished Fellows lecture programs in our series for 2021 to 2022. You may be aware that the Huntington is one of the largest and most competitive research fellowship programs in the humanities in the United States. And one of its prize assets is its endowments, which allow us to bring in any given year 5 or 6 distinguished fellows into residence by invitation to provide academic leadership in the program. One of those fellowships was founded in honor of R. Stanton Avery, who was once a Huntington trustee, and in fact, a trustee of the Getty also. And in his honor, an endowment was created for the specific purpose of supporting a position devoted to research in any humanities field where the Huntington collections are strong. And past Avery Fellows have included Professors Martha Howell, Ken Warren, Kathleen Wilson, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, and this year, Jim Chandler. We have 2 Avery Fellows in residence this year, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce one of them. Tonight's speaker is Wendy Wall, Avalon Foundation Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English at Northwestern University, where she's taught since 1989. Wendy holds a BA from the University of Alabama and her MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She's held and received fellowships from the Folger Shakespeare Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine and the British Library in London, the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities at Northwestern, and the Mellon Foundation Humanities Without Walls program. As I'm sure you all know, she's the author of The Imprint of Gender, Authorship and Publication in the English Renaissance, Staging Domesticity, Household Work and English Identity in Early Modern Drama, which won the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award when it appeared in 2002, Recipes for Thought, Knowledge and Taste in the Early Modern English Kitchen in 2015. She's also co-editor in 2020 of a special issue of the Journal of Early Modern Culture entitled The Poetry of Hester Pulter. As you will hear, she's the co-creator with Leah Knight of Brock University of the Poulter Project, an open access collaborative digital edition of the poems of the recently discovered writer Hester Poulter. This project was recognized as the best project in digital scholarship by the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women and Gender and received the Modern Language Association Prize for collaborative bibliographical or archival scholarship. Wendy is in residence at the Huntington working on a project entitled Revolution, Resurrection and Dissolution, Hester Pulter and the Reimagined Early Modern World. And it's from that project that this evening's talk is derived. To discuss blasting into space, the poetics of faith and astronomy in 17th century England, please welcome the 2021 to 22 Avery Distinguished Fellow at the Huntington, Professor Wendy Wall.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the introduction and for all that you do to make it possible for the fellows to be here. Thanks also to Catherine Wary-Miller and Juan Gomez for making events like this work. I'm really grateful to be at the Huntington this year, which sponsors such a vibrant intellectual community. Let me start with a scene. A woman in 1648, perilously sick and confined to her bedroom after giving birth to her 15th child, sought solace in an unusual manner. Hester Pulter wrote a poem about blasting into space to explore the universe. For her, this was not an odd subject. The very first poem in her collection, The Eclipse, signals that astronomy will be a central reference point for her religious, personal, and political verse. In subsequent poems, Poulter circles back over 25 times to the stars to confirm truths and ponder mysteries. Why does Venus appear differently in the night sky? How do we confirm that the sun is at the center of the universe? What are the motions of planets? These cutting-edge astronomical inquiries often cropped up as Poulter narrates interstellar journeys that promise to liberate her from life's oppression, and they will also allow her to explore feelings of euphoria, rage, loneliness, despair, and grief. How might this female poet, who is just becoming known to a wider audience, enlarge our understanding of how early modern English writers connected religion, science, and the imagination. How might Poulter's poetry reveal ways that 17th century women engaged in intellectual production, even from their remote estates or from their bedrooms? To tackle these issues, let me first introduce Poulter to those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading her works. Her story begins in the modern age, just 20 years ago, when a graduate student brought to light the only extant manuscript of her works at the University of Leeds Library. And here you can see it in its lovely binding with the gilt lettering. It's not a throwaway notebook, but very lovingly and expensively preserved. One of the titles reads, "Poems Breathed Forth by the Noble Hadassah." And Hadassah was a pseudonym for the biblical Esther in the Bible, the Jewish female public heroine. And Esther is obviously a variant on Hester's name. Composed in the 1640s and 1650s, these poems reveal that an elite woman living on her estate in Herefordshire was, unbeknownst to the public, a prolific writer. Testing out different poetic forms, Poulter wrote pastorals, political protests, satires, elegies, garden poems, animal fables, meditations on vegetarianism, and anguished devotional lyrics carried out in what we might today call a scientific register. While her poems range across alchemy, physics, cosmology, herbalism, mythology, the Bible, and botany, they are also deeply personal. Many have a confessional tone. One poem, for instance, offers a meditation of an aging 47-year-old woman looking in the mirror. The manuscript is filled with complaints that seem strangely prophetic, given her literary obscurity. "Why must I forever be confined," she writes plaintively, "against the noble freedom of my mind?" What do we know about Poulter? Well, not that much. She was born in 1605 in Dublin, the daughter of James Leigh. He was a judge who later rose to stature to become the first Earl of Marlborough. She moved to England when she was 3 years old, and at age 15, she married Arthur Poulter, a Cambridge-educated member of the landed gentry who withdrew from politics during the Civil War, largely because his support for Charles I put him and his family in peril. Over 23 years, Poulter had 15 children, all but 2 of whom died before her. So if you add it up, it's about 135 months of pregnancy. As an ardent royalist, she was a religious minority in her home county. Now, there's no evidence that she wrote poetry until she was 40 years old and faced the turbulent years of the Civil War and interregnum. Although she never published her works, she cared enough about them to gather the poems she'd written over decades together and to have a scribe copy them into a manuscript, a process that she carefully supervised. She went through the manuscript, she corrected mistakes, she added lines that were left out. And you see here just a snippet to show you what the manuscript looks like. And in Poulter's handwriting, she's added in the margin that there was a couplet that was left out. Even though Poulter sometimes addressed a wider public in her poems, she mentions, "This is a poem for you ladies, this is for you gallants," she never circulated them beyond her family. Why not? Perhaps in this political climate, her indecorous invectives against parliamentarians would have been seen as controversial. Perhaps restricting her audience gave her permission to air views that were maybe improper for a woman. We don't know. We can only speculate, and I can speculate a little more in the discussion after the talk. There is no record of the household library at Broadfield Estate where she lived, but given her family status, she would have had a classical elite education. And from the intrinsic evidence of her poems, it seems that she read classical and contemporary works on a wide range of subjects. Classical works by Ovid, Pliny, Plutarch, Virgil, the Bible, contemporary works by John Donne, George Herbert, Robert Burton. There are no journals or records of her life, save a few diary entries by her brother-in-law mentioning that she visited London when she was 50 years old. We do know that a local rector in her region, annotated her works in the early 18th century. And then they went underground, probably stored in an attic for centuries. Although the Leeds Library published this volume at an auction in 1975, no one really noticed it until the early 21st century, when UK scholars began discussing it. Elizabeth Clark, who shepherded the manuscript into the database Perdita, said, "I think Hester Pulter is the female poet many of us have been waiting for." When I read a few Poulter poems in an anthology, I agreed, maybe because of the intellectual range, but also the emotional power. I was so fascinated that I joined with Leah Knight at Brock University to co-create a free, accessible digital edition of the poems. And what's unusual about this site is that it's collaboratively created by a team of over 35 scholars across 3 continents. I think it's fitting that a woman who complained so much about being confined and intellectually lonely now has an afterlife within a teeming international collective. And if you want to read her poems, there's the URL at the top. All the poems are there for you to see. The people in the Poulter Project have taught me so much that my knowledge is completely intertwined with theirs. So I've listed here on the left the Poulter Project collaborators, in addition to Leah Knight, whose work and knowledge I will inevitably draw from tonight. And on the right, there are 3 scholars who have worked particularly on Poulter's poetry and astronomy. To understand, and if I'd love to talk more about why I created a digital website rather than putting this project into print. And again, that's something I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. To understand Poulter's foray into the skies, let's consider first how stargazing is represented in literature of the period. In Shakespeare's 1596 The Merchant of Venice, a character named Lorenzo meditates on the moonlit sky. He says, "Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patterns of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion, like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubim." In this lyrical moment, Lorenzo imagines the classic geocentric system that had been formalized by Ptolemy in the 2nd century. He segues from a vision of twinkling gold fixtures on a solid firmament, much like the basement of heaven, to the music of the spheres, a concept Pythagoras described in which celestial bodies move so uniformly they emit a mystical hum. The geocentric universe was finite, with the Earth at the center surrounded by concentric solid crystalline spheres, and there was a clear boundary between the sublunary region below the moon and that which was above the moon. And you can see the fixed stars if you keep going up from the moon, Venus, Mercury, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. You see the fixed stars in the firmament there. Though Shakespeare elsewhere represented disputes about cosmology, this moment of stargazing in Merchant of Venice, as in numerous early modern literary representations, captures one view of the appeal of classical cosmology as a site of beauty and order. When 17th century English religious poets gazed upwards, they often thought of the biblical passage, this one in which flight allowed transcendence to an idealized sphere. This is from Psalms, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then I would fly away and be at rest." And I have the image of this from an emblem book at the Huntington that Poulter read. I shouldn't read the one at the Huntington, but you get it. Poet and clergyman Thomas Traherne, for instance, felt his soul ascending to a realm that led him to spiritual enlightenment. He cited this verse and then said, "My inclinations raised me up on high and guided me to all infinity. A secret self I had enclosed within that was not bounded with my clothes or skin or terminated with my sight, the sphere of which was bounded with the heavens here." Moving upwards for Traherne was simultaneously a move inward to an expansive interior universe not limited by sensory perception. For to her, Neoplatonic flights of the soul could confirm a confident, even proprietary self. The earth, the seas, the light, the day, the skies, he writes of his aerial view, the sun and stars are mine, if those I prize. Poet George Herbert also saw the stars as portals to a transcendent world, but he recognized that soaring beyond one's comfort zone could be unsettling. He writes in The Temper, although there were some 40 heavens or more, sometimes I peer above them all. He has this sense of adventure, but then he backs off and admits to God, oh, rack me not to such a vast extent. Those distances belong to thee. The world's too little for thy tent, a grave too big for me. And the rack was a very brutal form of state torture where they actually dismembered a person. So he's kind of tempering the pleasure of discovering new territory with a kind of alarming incomprehensibility of infinity. The vastness of space makes him crave something like a cozier space. And eventually his journey pushes him to see that he really need not leave Earth at all. He says to God, whether I fly with angels, fall with dust, thy hands made both, and I am there. Thy power and love, my love and trust, makes one place everywhere. So space becomes kind of a red herring or an illusion in this sort of metaphysical, immersive experience that ends with an incredible reassurance about his place in the world. So when these 17th century English religious poets felt a wondrous comfort gazing upwards, they had to ignore recent astronomical findings. When John Donne did contemplate what was called the new philosophy, what we call science, it caused pure panic. Discovery of a new star had left the world bereft. And these are words that a lot of scholars cite to talk about the sense of trauma that the 17th century thinkers could experience. Donne says, and new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth. And no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament, they see so many new. They see that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone. Fire was one of the four elements, along with air, water, and earth in the classical system defined by Empedocles. And this was being subject to challenge at the time. So scrambling the planets and physics with which astronomy was aligned, Donne saw despair. It has shredded a knowledge system to tatters. 'Tis all in pieces. I think I was writing this talk when I saw that movie, Don't Look Up, came out, and I imagine John Donne with his sort of serious sense of despair about not looking up for reassurance of God anymore. In the 17th century, the skies were increasingly alien and threatening territory, a site of controversy. Although Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism had reached the Earth in the mid-16th century, the real game changer was in 1572, when a new star became visible to the naked eye. And I think it lasted about 17 months and then disappeared. This supernova, which shone brightly, sent intellectuals, sovereigns, and ministers scurrying for explanation. Was it a portent, like the star that guided the Magi to the Christ birthplace? Was it a sign of cosmic decline? Or was the Ptolemaic universe all wrong? Astronomer Tycho Brahe's measurements published the following year confirmed that the supernova lacked parallax, the sort of semi-angle of inclination along two sightlines. And therefore, the new star was in this supposedly perfect, immutable realm in the heavens. Mathematician Thomas Digges translated and recirculated Copernican ideas after the new star and speculated about infinity. And the publication of Johannes Kepler's calculations and his work on elliptical orbits gave a lot more credence to Copernican theory. Finally, Galileo's 1610 starry messenger offered telescopic confirmation of 4 new planets, the orbiting satellites of Jupiter, sunspots, and phases of Venus. The Ptolemaic system was no longer adequate for describing the heavens. The realm of the stars might be as imperfect as the Earth. Space might be empty instead of congealed spheres. The cosmos might be infinite. If the Earth rested only on the margins of the universe, it was a short leap to wondering about extraterrestrial life, which seemed pointedly at odds with Christian accounts of world creation and the singularity of the resurrection of Christ. Why would God send his only son to die only on one planet if it were one world among others? While most early modern astronomers saw absolutely no conflict between their science and their solid Christian beliefs, people on the ground, even a lot of ministers, were worried that the new astronomy made people uncomfortable and could rock the foundations of theology. For Poulter, however, the heliocentric world was surprisingly an exciting intellectual prospect. In her poetry, she was fascinated with precisely the aspects of Copernicanism that were wreaking havoc. The stars knew mobility. So she took that gesture of the devotional gesture of wanting to take flight into the heavens as a kind of launch pad. And today I am going to ask you to think about 3 different ways that Poulter used her space travel to fuse astronomy with Christianity, with some surprising results. Strategy 1 was the most conventional. It involved converting scientific information into a reassuringly Christian metaphoric system, that is, making Copernican space fit a devotional practice. The title to her poem, The Center, points to the new astronomical system she will explore. Poulter begins by expressing her fervent desire to alter planetary motions through the sheer force of her will. But listen to how her sentence keeps deferring completion of her thought. Oh, that the splendent and illustrious sun, round whom the planet's triple motions run, diurnal, annual, trepidation, yet that all-quickening orb keeps still his station, whilst they above his throne dance each his measure according to the great Creator's pleasure. Oh, that his influence, his heat, his light would clasp this globe, that these shades of night might this our horoscope involve no more, nor me the loss of day so oft deplore. Okay, so this is tricky syntax, right? It just says, oh, that the sun would, and then finally you get to the verb, clasp this globe. The speaker wants the sun to hold the earth, either drawing it close into a hug or fastening beams onto it. And she wants this because it will make perpetual light overcome a darkness that she associates with spiritual gloom. But if the point is a spiritual allegory, it's really odd that she interrupts herself at line 2. Oh, and by the way, did you know that the planets circle the sun? By the way, do you know they have 3 motions, just like Copernicus theorized? And did I mention again that the sun actually does not move, but keep his station? Poulter then gracefully merges Christianity with heliocentrism by importing the language of monarchy into the mix, conceptualizing the planets as dancing around the sun's throne, which was licensed by the great creator's pleasure. So the idea of the sun as an emblem of royalty is hit home by the word throne. If Donne lamented the disproportion of the skies, Poulter appreciates the vitalizing dance of measures that she expresses through some uneven poetic meter. As the poem continues, she becomes frustrated by her inability to push beyond the solar system's boundaries. She says, must the sun's orb confine my thoughts also? Must they, me, must they no higher go? So bumping up against the limits of human knowledge, her thoughts plunge to earth and she has to devise a solution. She will return to earth and ground herself in the natural world and interpret heliocentrism metaphorically by enthroning her creator, the figure of the sun within her spiritual practice. She promises to make her maker the sum and center of her praise, as the last line says. And this entails a commitment to a creative mode of poetic making. She will use Copernicanism, that is, as a figurative mechanism to sort out her spiritual priorities and theorize her poetry as orbiting God. One striking element of the design principle in Poulter's manuscript, as several readers have observed, is its cyclical structure. Poulter repeats titles for poems. 4 are called the circle, with each refracting circularity through a different lexicon. One's about grief, one's about divine creation, one's about alchemy, one's about life cycles. 5 are named Aurora, and so on. There's a kind of rotation and return of concepts, of rhymes, of titles. Even the poem I just showed you, the center, puts the word center at the title, at the midpoint of the poem, and in the last line. Scholars have looked to Poulter's own astronomical vocabulary to describe and theorize this architecture. Louisa Hall discovers, quote, a titular vortex at the center of the manuscript, where repetitions aggregate. Laura Dodds describes Poulter's eclipse poetics, and Liza Blake sees the text's constant returns to dust, urns, dissolution, and involution as mimicking planetary revolutions. Poulter used heliocentrism, I'm suggesting, as an innovative book structure as well as a devotional theme. So that's one strategy. A second strategy is to use space travel to grapple with epistemological questions critical to the rise of experimental science in the 17th century, including the role of observation and the problem of what counts as knowledge. These were questions tackled by Francis Bacon, by Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, among others. In a poem called The Perfection of Patience and Knowledge, Poulter narrates an unorthodox death experience. She imagines her soul launched out. She says, then my enfranchised soul away beyond the sky will take her flight. Her soul is launched out, but not going directly to God, but aimed toward attaining total knowledge of physical phenomena. Her soul circles for over 20 lines to find definitive answers to secular questions about lunar changes, astrological influence, and planetary motion. It is only after death, she says, then shall we know these orbs of wonder, which in a maze we now live under. At the heart of the poem is the question, what counts as knowledge? And when in the scope of time and from what vantage point can you access it? Only in the last 6 lines of the poem does the speaker remember that she's supposed to be more interested in the blessed afterlife than in material phenomenon. She turns from her research at that point to privilege, as Liza Blake explains, the spiritual mode of knowing articulated in 1 Corinthians. So the last lines of the poem say, after she's dead, after the world has been calcined, nay, we shall know without which all is none, the eternal essence, even as we are known. And this is a paraphrasing of 1 Corinthians that says, then shall I know even as also I am known. And the word knowing there has now straddled from something about secular knowledge and how you know it to a kind of divine beholding, of mutual beholding of herself and God. Even as Poulter advises patience to her reader and signals the importance of sorting out divine and secular knowledges, I noticed that she's sort of impatient and doesn't wait for final judgment day to pose her possible answers to these secular astronomical queries. In fact, she creates a poetic artifact that contains a Copernican knowledge-centered afterlife. Okay, so the third strategy is the one I want to spend a little more time with because I think it's the more radical and interesting. Here, Poulter uses space imaginaries to consider the thorny problems of embodiment, as well as the problem of knowing. That is, what is the body before Descartesian dualism reigns supreme? And how does gender fit into knowing what your body is? I think the best poem for looking at this problem is poem 45, which has a very long title and very noteworthy. The title is, "This was written 1648 when I lay in with my son John, being my 15th child. I, being so weak in 10 days and nights, I never moved my head one jot from my pillow, out of which great weakness my gracious God restored me, as I still live, to magnify his mercy." It's quite a title. What does it tell us? Well, it obviously provides a religious framework, leading the reader to expect a sacred poem. It also insists that the poem is biographical and occasional, fixed solidly in the time-bound moment of Poulter's reproductive immobility. So it's not framed as a kind of universal transcendence of the soul. And maybe I should say something about lying in, because this was a month-long childbirth ritual that began when a woman went into labor and would typically conclude with her going to a ritual churching ceremony. During this time, women were confined to chambers and they only saw other women. Given infant and maternal mortality rates, women treated pregnancy as a time to reflect on death. When some women found out they were pregnant, they went out and bought they bought winding sheets, so their burial fashion. Some wrote advice books to their unborn children, like Elizabeth Jocelyn, who sends out her mother's legacy to her unborn child in 1624, as she states, quote, "not knowing whether I shall live to instruct thee." And in fact, she was prophetic because she died 9 days after giving birth, and this was published posthumously. Women attending their churches might have had their eyes wander to some of the tombstones and gravestones in the church while they were listening to the sermon, and they might have seen something like this, which marked a woman's death in childbirth, the sort of cradling of the child in her arms. A shout out to Amanda Zock, who has wonderfully explored what she calls the felt mortality of pregnancy. Now, when writing her lying in poem, Poulter had not only been pregnant 15 times, but she had also lost 6 children, Hester, William, Charles, Elizabeth, and Jane among them. Rather than meditating on death, Poulter ruminates about seeking out new worlds in space. She opens the poem with a quintessential devotional gesture of taking flight, bidding her thoughts permission to escape her body. "Sad, sick, and lame, as in my bed I lay," she writes, "lest pain and passion should bear all the sway, my thoughts being free, I bid them take their flight above the gloomy shades of death and night." Her release of herself is retrofitted to speak to the specific female vulnerability here, the incapacity from childbirth, and the word bear there connects childbearing back to the title. But while she links creative poetic production to reproduction, it is really not in the way that readers of early modern literature might expect. She does not claim, for instance, maternal authority to speak, as did writers of mother's advice books, or as do many characters on the stage, like John Webster's Duchess of Malfi. The womb is instead a debilitating constraint best left behind. It kind of smacks of Lady Macbeth, who famously tried to rid herself of bodily constraints when she said, "Unsex me here." Poulter then imagines her thoughts journeying up to that sphere where night's pale queen doth run round the circumference of the illustrious sun. In true Poulterian form, she then tours the reader through a granularly detailed cosmos, chock full of information, including Galileo's sighting of Jupiter's moons. What she first discovers is that poets have misrepresented Earth's moon. This is what she says of the moon. "Nor did she seem to me as poets feign, guiding her chariot with a silver rein, attired like some fair nymph or virgin queen, with naked neck and arms and robes of green. Lovesick Endymion oft hath thus her seen." So Endymion was a shepherd who was beloved by the moon goddess, and in various myths, Diana or Selene would come to visit him. And this is a 1650 painting that does show, and indeed the naked neck and arms might be traditionally associated with the moon here. Repudiating the depiction of the moon as a virgin queen whose body is idealized, Poulter marvels instead that the moon is another world, meaning a planet, much like Earth. She says, but as my thoughts about her orb were hurled, I did perceive she was another world. Thus being in my fancy raised so far, this world appeared to me another star. And as the moon a shadow casts and light, so is our Earth the empress of their night. When her thoughts are hurled into orbit, it allows the affordance of an imaginary telescope, which offers a radically new vantage point. If the moon is just another world, it is no longer the gateway dividing corruptible from pure spheres. It's a planet, seemingly inhabited and constituted like the Earth. The privileged place of the Earth in a geocentric universe erodes as the speaker imagines lunar inhabitants staring up into the skies and seeing the Earth reflecting the sun's light. We have become the empress of their night. As Laura Dodds has so wonderfully shown, Poulter poetically constructs the image that the Apollo 8 mission would render for the modern world in 1968, the famous picture called Earthrise, the transformative moment of seeing ourselves in our entirety as a globe from space. The thrill for Poulter lies in defamiliarizing the Earth, worlding it, we might say, positioning it as another celestial body. And once she's unmoored from an earthbound perspective, she can go on to confirm other knowledges. She knows that the Earth, the center was of all the rest, the planets, all like bowls still trundling round the vast circumference of his glorious mound. He, resting, quickens all with heat and light, and by the Earth's motions makes our day or night. Resting in stasis, the sun can quicken, meaning to birth or enliven the planets. And her next simile works to resolve one of heliocentrism's conceptual challenges by comparing planets to the balls that people rolled in the common leisure sport called a game of bowls. And here she's kind of making bocce ball into like bowling with the stars. The 17th century imagination, as we've seen, not only enabled a counterfactual experience like space travel, but it was recruited to make shockingly new things legible. We see this even more clearly in a poem in which Poulter converts space into a soccer field. She says, when my freed soul flies to her place of birth, then am I brave. My foot then spurns this earth. My mind being raised above these worldly jars, methinks I play at football with the stars. And this idea of Poulter's foot kicking the earth and her taking off into the vastness of space, kind of blithely kicking planets around, is really quite amazing. And it has been beautifully analyzed by Vicki Burke. So given its fantastic nature, Poulter's poetry might seem quite remote from scientific writing. But is this true? The texts most successful in establishing findings from the new astronomy in the 17th century were marked as fictions. Kepler's text Somnium, the Dream, took the form of a cosmic voyage using an early version of science fiction that had intrigued past writers, including the ancient classical author Lucian, who had a lunar voyage, and early modern writers like Thomas More and Ariosto, who used speculative fiction. Rather than offering a treatise, Kepler narrates dreaming about a lunar voyage in which he learns about the geography, climatology, and inhabitants of the land he calls Livonia. Like Poulter, Kepler offers an optical experiment, Earth, envisioned from a lunar-centric vantage point, which allows him to rebut objections to heliocentrism, namely the inability to measure the parallax of the fixed stars from Earth. In the 1630s, English bookstalls were filled with popular stories about space travel. The 1638 Man in the Moon by Bishop and historian Francis Godwin narrates the picaresque adventures of a man named Domingo Gonzalez, who, when shipwrecked on an island, creates an engine pulled by a flock of birds that convey him to the moon. This text is clearly indebted to traveler's tales and to romance, but it also comments on gravitation, the Earth's diurnal rotation, and the possibility of plural worlds. Clergyman and mathematician John Wilkins, a founding member of the Royal Society of London, wrote The Discovery of a World in the Moon, which mentions Godwin's romance fanciful work as having a kind of kindred mission. So you see this kind of cross-fertilization between texts that we think of now as scientific and those that we think of as literary. And Poulter was probably familiar with Cambridge Platonist Henry Moore's 1646 dense and very, very long philosophical poem that's about the infinity of worlds, which took the form of a soul traveling through current space. And it was modeled in form on Spenser's Faerie Queene. So there is a lot of this dialogue. 17th century writers of fiction and popular science asked, how might one demonstrate astronomical truths from a terrestrial viewpoint, given that the Earth's motions cannot be evidenced by relying on bodily experience? After all, the sun seems to move, the Earth stays still. How can we turn a telescope on Earth itself? If the rise of experimental science brought with it a premium on observation, it was equally concerned with how virtual witnessing and the technology of the imagination could validate counterintuitive truths. Poulter's Lying In poem thus does not look radically different from what we now categorize as early modern science writing, even when she mythologizes planets or credits the existence of lunar inhabitants. Making perspective relative, a technique shared by Kepler and Wilkins, creates the visualization necessary for scrutinizing traditional paradigms. But Poulter's gender might offer a new viewpoint. So let's return to Poulter's Lying In poem to see the dramatic turn it takes as her journey concludes. When Poulter tries to gaze at the remote stars, she abruptly returns home. She says, then on the fixed stars, I would have gazed, but their vast brightness, so my mind amazed that my affrighted fancy downward flew, just as the hours Aurora's curtain drew. Poulter's amazed, meaning stupefied or stunned by the star's radiance, which coincide with the sunrise that her body left behind on Earth is experiencing. She describes the goddesses presiding over celestial revolutions, the aura or hours, and they're drawing open the metaphorical curtains of night to reveal dawn, aurora, just as her fancy plunges to Earth. Now, at this point in the poem, I would expect her to mention the dangers of overreaching as a reason for a return. This is a common move in much poetry. It's seen, for instance, in Milton's epic Paradise Lost, published 20 years after Poulter's lunar poem, where the angel Raphael offers a spiritual lesson to Adam after they discuss astronomy. He says, be lowly wise. Think only what concerns thee and thy being. Dream not of other worlds, what creatures there live in what state, condition, or degree. So Raphael's telling Adam that the revelations of heaven are more important than secular revelations. And we've seen in Poulter's poem, The Center, that she also has that strategy when she calls attention to the limits of the known world. But in this Lying In poem, she takes it in an entirely unexpected direction. She stages a drama of fear in the skies. Here, she says, the mythological wife of Acheron, night, and Acheron is a term for Hades in the underworld, is furiously beating a hasty retreat from the power of day. Night is violently slashing her horses with her brood of horrific children in tow. Her offspring include the Humanities or the Furies, who are the underworld goddesses of justice and vengeance that many depicted as deadly twisted sisters with snaky wild hair. And on the right, you see from the Bruegel picture of painting of Juno in the underworld. These were the Humanities. So Poulter writes, and here she's talking about night. The ugly wife of Acheron bid drive and slashed her drowsy monsters on. With her, There went her firstborn brat, old error, and fierce Humanities, poor mortals' terror, who with their snakes and whips and brands were hurled to strike amazement to the lower world, being scared themselves at the approach of light. To our antipodes, they took their flight. Poulter describes an insomniac's worst nightmare. The Humanities join with their sibling error to torture humans who are dreaming on Earth, which Poulter interestingly interprets as a displacement of their own resentful submission to the power of the goddess of the dawn, Aurora. It's really remarkable, this description of night terrors, and Poulter does give this in several poems. So astronomy suddenly gives way to the emotional life of cosmology, taking place in the skies with humans as pawns. And as the psychic turbulence unfolds, it increasingly stages a reproductive horror. Sin's cursed offspring with their dam did trace that most prodigious and incestuous race, pale, ghastly, shuddering horror, lost despair and sobbing sorrow, tearing off her hair. These of her sable womb were born and bred, and from the light with her, now frighted, fled. So Poulter's drawing here on mythological sources to create this kind of phantasmagoric nightmare, which portrays night as incestuous because she coupled with her brother Erebus to produce these freakish offspring. Poulter reworks her sources to add allegorical children, horror, despair, and sorrow. And you see that they wrench and convulse, almost as if daybreak were undergoing an agonizing childbirth. Look at the wording: brat, offspring, womb, bred. All this is really a description of sunrise, but sunrise is refracted through the reproductivity highlighted in the poem's title. Imprisoned in a postpartum paralysis, a lot of P's, Poulter dreams of escaping to new worlds, but she ends up making the stars into procreative terrors, albeit in a sphere in which female figures exert some truly scary power. The tenor of this poem is a far cry from the traditional stargazing devotional poems that we have looked at. Think back to those ones we read earlier. George Herbert ends one poem by leaning into divine care. He imagines being lovingly enveloped in the beauty of the cosmos. The stars have put us to bed, he murmurs. This is a really stark contrast with Poulter's horrific depiction in the skies. In the last 4 lines of her poem, Poulter does remember that this is supposed to be a poem about spiritual gratitude, and she tries to create some emotional equilibrium. She says, "And then my maids, my window curtains drew, and as my pain, so comforts did renew. And to the God of truth, light, life, and love, all such lays here begin, shall end above." So the comforting everydayness of the world is marked by female servants who pull the curtain aside and tend to the postpartum body. Within this solace of domestic care, she promises to write lays or praise songs. And these can only materialize in preliminary fashion on Earth, but they will be completed when she ascends again after death. The odd grammatical syntax, all such lays here begin, shall end above, hints at the imperfections of earthly writing that the line asserts. This is something that Philip Sidney, for instance, does in Astrophel and Stella. Poulter's move from biological to textual reproduction is signaled by wordplay. The title's lying in is echoed in the first lines, laying in bed, and finally in the lays that she promises to sing. Does her poem triumph in asserting authorial control over the trauma of childbirth, as Amanda Zock has argued? Does it provide imaginative compensation for the isolation that she felt in part because of reproduction, as Louisa Hall suggests? Debating whether the poem substitutes, critiques, or reproduces the constraints of the body puts Poulter's work squarely in robust debates about the representation of female agency in literature of the period. It was the fundamental problem of having a body, intensified by gender, that Poulter develops here and in other space poems. Rather than mapping reproduction's discontents into the heavens, she elsewhere morphs out of her body. In a poem called A Solitary Complaint, she airs what I see as her planet envy. Listen to her lament about the planets that have a liberty denied to her. Must I be still confined to this sad grove, when as those vast and globous globes above eternally in treble motions move, she asks. In Poulter-like fashion, she goes on to narrate the Copernican ordering of planets and the possibility of multiple galaxies. But she bends her devotional poem here into more radical directions by asking God to convert her soul into a planet. Then, oh, my God, irradiate my sad soul, that I about thy glorious throne may roll. Let me, the meanest of these stars, attend, then all my rays in praise shall reascend. For thee and only thee I will adore, my God, forever, evermore. Poulter wants to be irradiated, meaning brightened or illuminated, into an orbiting celestial body, and she presents it as a quid pro quo arrangement. If God will use divine alchemy, the conversion of matter, to purify her soul into a fiery entity, she will repay him with poetic offerings, rays that enfold, as the word does sonically, praise. The repetition here intensifies emotion, but also shows her circling back to, dare I say, revolving words. And even the word sad had a material register. It meant heavy or weighty, an emotion tied to the element earth. Poulter here wants to have it upgraded to the element of fire. Although male devotional poets sometimes imagine dispersing and dilating into airy substances, they usually reconstituted into the confident knowing subjects of humanism. When Donne imagines the afterlife in his writings, as well as in the death monument he designed, he hopes that his glorified heavenly self will resemble his human form. And this is the very famous funeral monument that Donne had created before his death that's in St. Paul's Church in London. And he supposedly posed for it in his winding sheet. And you see that he's standing on an urn, which was the symbolic container for human remains. And he almost is like rising up out of it. And Donne really worried about whether he would have his human body after death, something he worried in his sermons and in his poems. He was, despite his theological instincts, quite attached to the flesh. Poulter, by contrast, revels in shedding her body, both in fantasy and afterlife. But she doesn't become a spirit as much as another material form, a comet, a meteor, a planet. Throughout her poems, she celebrates being irradiated, calcined, rarefied, diffused, being unmade and remade in alchemical and astronomical terms. Only by resigning her human form can she inhabit a redemptive mobility. She writes, then whether dissolution or transmigration or rolling revolution, all ends in thy salvation. And transmigration obviously is the concept that your soul will flit into another body after your death, sometimes in animal form. So she's just blending astronomy, a pagan belief, and Christian salvation here. I close with my favorite poem, where Poulter draws atomism into her vision of an empowering Christian Copernican afterlife. She writes, for I no liberty expect to see, until to atoms I dispersed be. Then being enfranchised, free as my verse, I shall surround this spacious universe, until by other atoms thrust and hurled, we give a being to another world. Freedom means being dispersed into particles, freely dancing in the solar system, becoming a superpowered force jettisoned into cosmological otherworldliness. Here, Poulter engages contemporary intellectual discussion of atomism, drawing on the classical writer Lucretius, who theorized the world as endlessly circulating atoms, whose collision produces new forms. Turning into particles offers Poulter a collective, post-human cosmic citizenship, Look how it becomes collective. We give a being, she says, to another world. And she calls herself enfranchised. Instead of lamenting that everything is in pieces, as did Donne, Poulter sees dissolution as a generative state, one that can birth brave new worlds. So, where does this consideration of Poulter's works leave us? I would say it's time for new mapping. Scholars have painstakingly mined the patchwork of references to heliocentrism and geocentrism in Shakespeare's and Donne's works. Then they tend to leap forward several decades to concentrate on Milton's Paradise Lost as the most sophisticated representation of cosmology during a time of scientific revolution. Only recently has the work of Margaret Cavendish, who envisioned traveling to new worlds as readily as she thought about atomism, been added to this story. Poulter promises to make an extraordinary contribution to our understanding of how writers engaged changing knowledge systems to reimagine faith and consciousness. The fact that we didn't have a clue that Poulter had written anything until 25 years ago also raises a crucial question about our knowledge system and our blind spots. How many other Poulters were there whose works have been lost, perhaps because the writers were not well connected to men of letters or visible in intellectual or literary circles? How many women engaging in knowledge production have blasted into space, but have simply, so to speak, flown beneath the radar of our scholarship? Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, so much for that wonderful close reading of a remarkable corpus of poetry. Some of your metaphors are absolutely staggering. Let's start with a question from a non-specialist, that is to say me, while I invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A function. So you've chosen in the talk this evening to focus on those poems which engage with astronomical heliocentric ideas. Looking at the corpus as a whole, how prominent are those themes throughout the collection of poetry? Do they saturate the corpus? Are they incidental to it? Or if you could characterize the place of those types of themes relative to the corpus as a whole.
Yeah, you're talking about the themes of astronomy in particular,
yes.
not
yes.
just science.
Yes.
Yes. So I mentioned that she titles the first poem The Eclipse, but there's at least 25 poems that come back and either make the stars prominent, talk specifically about Copernicanism. I'm interested in 4 poems that are devotional, because I'm interested in putting Poulter into a literary history and saying she's not just part of an intellectual history, but she took a form called, devotional poetry, and she remade it using new astronomy. But if you broaden out from devotional poetry, she refers to the stars, to the movements of planets, even in, say, her political poetry, where she's lamenting the king has been imprisoned, and that in one poem, and that he's been killed in another. And she says the sun, if a constellation disappeared, that would be one thing. But how can you take the sun and have the sun disappear? It's actually at the center of our universe, by the way. And Charles was the sun. And she has this beautiful rhyme of saying, if the sun loses his line ecliptic, the world will be epileptic. So there are ways that's not the majority of the poem, but that's the way that she draws in space and the movements of the planets into her poems that are centrally about something else, whether it's about grief, whether it's about war, trauma. But I would say that astronomy does, as I mentioned, constitute 1/5 of the poems in the overall corpus.
Right.
And then science even more so if you take alchemy into account.
Terrific.
So this was a huge preoccupation of hers.
Absolutely, that's clear. Thank you. Let me turn to the audience then. Hello, Susan Emerson. It's great to have you in the audience. You ask a wonderful contextual question. What is the significance of the timing of Poulter starting to write a royalist woman starting to write in 1645. Do you think there's significance in the political context of that decision?
I think there's some biographical reasons and some political reasons. I think that when you're pregnant almost every year for 20 years, there's not a lot of time to write, and she didn't start to write until she was at the end of her reproductive cycle. But I think she also wrote when she said she was put into a more hermetic life, and that was because of politics. Because of her royalism, she was retreating out of the political sphere that she and her husband had moved in, at least regionally. And she was moving into a period where she could reflect on politics, but from more sustained isolation. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's something about the politics of the age as inspiring both royalist writing and non-royalist writing. And she falls into, I mean, it's not that just royalists responded to this because they retreated, but that was one impetus for her in her life. I think she was angry about the fact that she had a relatives die in fighting for Charles on her husband's side. She was very upset at monarchy disappearing and saw it as the foundation of the world crumbling. And this probably prompted some of her poetry, even though she does have a lot of poems that are also personal, pastoral, things like that. Right. So I do think that we are rethinking what it meant to have Civil War writing. And Sarah Ross has edited with Elizabeth Scott Bowman a wonderful collection of women's voices to add to Civil War writing. And she puts Poulter into that and says, okay, so, we've been thinking about cavalier poetry and, men drinking and praising the classical pastoral scenario, but let's look at more works. Let's look at works that weren't in print, for instance. What if we move away from printed sources? What if we look for women's voices? Right. And suddenly the politics, really start to change, I think, in that new landscape.
Thank you. So Dane, doesn't leave a surname, asks, is there any evidence of Poulter's poetry being inspired by personal visionary or revelatory experiences?
No.
You can't compute those.
No, given the poem I read tonight, the fact that she kind of has this trauma when she's looking up into the heavens and starts to see this kind of nightmare, I would think she might have described a vision, because there are a lot of poems that precisely are about a dream vision or a kind of, mystical, divine message from God. She never describes that. She's more, she bases a lot of her works on biblical passages. She obviously read a lot of meditations, prayers, sermons. She never once mentions any kind of special prophetic connection at all. In fact, the poem that I read today, the last one, she really seemed to be an insomniac, and she dreaded going to bed at night. Right. And yeah. She generalized from the despair she felt in dreaming bad dreams and not being able to sleep to a kind of mortal condition of all humans as they face sin, death, and mortality. So her idea of dreaming was not connected to a prophetic strand as much as a kind of other idea of dreams that were personal, maybe.
Right, thank you. So Jonathan Coke has a question about the formal structure of her poetry, commenting about the nature of the rhymes, sometimes arranged in couplets, other times in triplets. How would you interpret those particular techniques, as borrowing from or engaging in her interest in natural philosophy, for instance, or as engaging her faith in God?
Yeah, Jonathan and I have talked about this issue because he's pointed out to me some of the triplets that occur and the way that Dryden used triplets. And I've been looking at triplets used by other poets. I would have to say that I can't generalize across the poems to describe it, because often the triplet has a very particular meaning in the poem that's not connected to the Trinity, for instance, or not connected to citing another writer. There's one poem where she's writing in couplets and all of a sudden she throws in a triplet and it delays it throws in one more moment of horror and darkness before turning to make the poem have something about a revelation or redemptive aura. So there's a way in which I see the triplets functioning formally, specifically to the content of particular poems. I think she liked poetic experimentation. We often think that a lot of the female writers in the 17th century weren't as bold in their experimentation. And while she does mostly write in couplets, she tries tetrameter, she tries pentameter, she uses verses that are interlinked so that the last word rhymes, uniting 3 stanzas and then 3 more. So I can't generalize to say that the triplets are based in theology or in natural history, but I think each poem, she's using them very deliberately in an interesting way.
Thank you. So Eileen Reeves asks a question that was also at the back of my mind as well, in terms of the social or neighborhood context in which she's living. You say you can't really reconstruct her education or what she was precisely what she was reading. But Eileen wonders whether there were people in the neighborhood with telescopes or astronomical knowledge, or might themselves have been involved in networks of natural philosophers who were bringing these ideas to light for her.
Yeah, it's a great question, because recently we've uncovered women's writing, usually in the context of a manuscript culture that shows tons of intellectual circulation. And it's been precisely the fact that it wasn't in print, but in manuscript, and the fact that it was in this circulation that has alerted us that works that were not printed were not private. Poulter is an odd case because we don't have any manuscript circulation, and we have no record of any intellectual literary connections that she had. There are some speculations. Karen Britland has a wonderful article suggesting that in the region of Hertfordshire, there was a family living there, and she could have known them, and they did have a lot of traffic with London, including, I think, maybe a Marvel poem that came. But it's there's more work that needs to be done on that. Poulter did have relatives in London. She went to visit her sister Dionysia, and she was married to John Harrington, whose dad translated Ariosto. He was a very learned man. He had a huge library, his son did. And I can imagine them sharing certain intellectual resources. People have said she probably wouldn't have shared her poetry with him because it was so rude about parliamentarians, and he was more in that camp. She met an archbishop in London when she went to dinner, who was a very learned man, Usher, and he had a huge library and had even thought about traveling, in space, and whether lunar voyages were actually against theology, Christian theology or not. So I'm thinking there were some intellectual connections, and we just don't have letters or documents. We don't have any sense that there was a telescope in her neighborhood. We don't, and people have done a lot of digging to see if there were any traces of those kinds of connections.
Right, thank you. Rather specific question from Laura Alexander. What edition of Lucretius might she have read? Did she read De Rerum Natura in Latin, do you think?
Poulter only has a couple of Latin phrases in her poetry, and they're very common Latin phrases. So we don't know if she read Latin. The De Rerum was not translated. So it's a mystery, if she didn't read it, how she would have thought about these atoms and particles, unless she was just a really good, dinner party listener. Her sister in London, Margaret, did know Milton, and Milton wrote a sonnet to her sister. So, but there's no, it'd be great to know that Milton and she sat down to dinner and talked about Lucretius or something, somebody Milton knew. So we don't know what she reread. We don't know if she knew Latin. We don't know if she would have read something translated from another language. Women with her background sometimes, did learn French, certainly, could have smatterings of Latin. We know that from other women, but we just don't know yet how she got her Lucretius.
Okay, thank you. It would be a shame to spend time talking about Poulter without talking more specifically about the project and how it works. Would you like to say a little bit about how the network was built, how the collaborative edition is being driven forward?
Sure. So when I read Poulter's poems and I wanted them to be available for teaching, I had that quandary that a lot of us who teach with early modern women writers have, which is often their works are not available in print, or if they are in print, they go out of print very quickly. But I also wondered what a digital edition could offer that a print edition could not. And what it can offer is comparative versions of a single poem. And I was interested in having people encounter Poulter, not through the Norton anthology maybe, but in reading that head note that then becomes institutionalized in that one edition where you think that's the end all and be all, but maybe seeing that editing is a process of judgment. And to make a poem, an editor has to do a creative act. So for every poem in the Poulter Project, we have 2 editions by 2 different editors who come at the poems with their own perspective and knowledges to bring to bear. And I really liked that idea. A digital edition can do that, which print simply can't because of the space. It's too expensive. So for 120 poems, you need a lot of space. I also was tired of working in isolation in the humanities and thought, why can't I be part of some collaborative project? What would it be like to be in a truly collaborative project? Not like an edited collection, but one where I'm reading the lines and editing them with someone else, Lee and I. We read every poem, we transcribed it, and then we had to edit it, disagreeing sometimes on where the punctuation fell or how you pronounced a word or how many syllables a word had. I have a Southern drawl in me a little bit, and so I was giving, extra syllables there. So working with people in that kind of environment seemed like a great idea. So we put out a call for an advisory board, and we seeded the edition online with 7 editors, each of whom agreed to edit between 5 and 10 poems. And then we put out a call to the public. And when the public sends in a poem, when a scholar sends in an edition, it goes out for peer review. So it's a scholarly peer review so that the person's intellectual labor can be recognized in their institution and it can be quality controlled.
Right.
Then we have curations that are exhibits, and we invite anyone to make a curation, which basically tells you what bits of visual and textual culture you would teach around a question. The digital project was created through the MAD studio at Northwestern University, Media and Design Studio.
Right.
We got a grant from Northwestern, a seed grant of $30,000, and started the project with that. And used encoders, but then we have gotten graduate students and undergraduates in encoding. We've had graduate students in the UK, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and North America, and the US working on the project, some in a paid capacity and some as an internship. So to my mind, working with these 7 editors has been fantastic, and seeing the project have a real dialogue back and forth where people disagree about fundamental ideas of interpretation, about how you authenticate a historical record. It's really been an amazing experience. Digital websites have their challenges. I couldn't do everything we wanted. It's expensive. I want it to be durable and sustainable in the future. Right. So I've had to go to a lot of kind of digital conferencey kind of things to find out how to make sure that it doesn't disappear tomorrow and become a dead link. Right. How it keeps on going with new materials. And luckily, it's an ongoing accreting website that has new materials that come up every month or 2.
Right. That's a fantastic description of what's clearly a really wonderful experience. Can I bring you back to the rhetorical question with which you closed about the possibility that there are countless other writers, female writers, who've flown under our radar, as you put it? I mean, do you think she's an exceptional norm? That is to say, exceptional only to the extent that her corpus has eventually come to light? Or is she completely unique?
Well, I think the way that she thinks is unique. And I'm arguing for an extraordinary intellectual curiosity, an extraordinary sense of poetic talent, and an incredible voice. I mean, she's got a voice. I read it, and this is why I said I thought she was the poet I've been waiting for. When I teach some women writers, I respect their intellect, but their voice seems a little bit more remote historically, whereas my students respond immediately to Poulter's voice. So I think she's, perhaps unique in the way that all writers have their own creative stamp. What I meant, though, was we generalize often and say women didn't think much about astronomy. Women didn't think about, this part of science, or there aren't many women who would have known this. And then as we discover more and more manuscripts, we find out that our generalizations about literacy, our generalizations about how people exchanged information have simply been narrowed by the kinds of questions and we've asked and the kinds of archives we've used. So I guess I'm saying the fact that her work came so perilously close to not being discovered, that it probably lay in an attic for 250 years, that someone did lovingly correct it and annotate it in the early 18th century. But after that, it disappears and doesn't come back until 1975. It could have easily gotten thrown out.
Easily.
So the other I think there could have been a lot of other Poulters like that, who might have had their own creative way of asking questions and writing. And we simply haven't, we have to allow for that by virtue of the practices we use for preservation and the way that things are kept and what things are not kept. We have to kind of think about that. And there's so many people doing great work on, women writers, Mary Carey, and the Huntington has a lot of letters from very particular women writers. We have lots and lots of women writers whose works are expanding so that it's not just Catherine Phillips anymore. And it's not just Margaret Cavendish. There's a ton of manuscript work that's coming to light. So I guess I'm just saying we got to pay attention to not generalizing and also be aware of the kinds of new frames of reference we have to use when we treat these new discoveries.
Absolutely. On that optimistic note, we will conclude. Virtually every question that was posed tonight starts with a thank you, gratitude for a wonderful talk, amazing talk, excellent talk. And I'd just like to echo those sentiments. Thank you, Wendy, for blasting us into space.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Good night, everybody.